Next week, for the first time since 2020, the state of Tennessee will execute someone. The first man scheduled to be killed at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville is Oscar Smith. His execution date is May 22nd. The legal team that's been trying to prevent this day from coming includes my guest, federal public defender Kelley Henry. Kelley is part of the so-called habeas unit here in Nashville. They're responsible for appealing death penalty cases in federal court. Kelley believes that the death penalty is a relic that will eventually move past as a society. Until then, she is fighting for her guys, as she calls them. She has serious concerns about how the state is planning to carry out executions scheduled this year. The state of Tennessee hasn't disclosed how they obtained the execution drug, pentobarbital, or who they got it from.
They are asking the court to forbid our team from discovering who this person is, or persons, or entity, or whoever it is that they have procured this drug from the gray market.
Kelley's team has challenged this request, and they were in court on Friday for a hearing.
Good morning, this is Chancellor Perkins. I'm going to ask counsel for the movement to identify yourselves, and then we'll hear the motion basically for an order of protection.
Good morning, Your Honor. Cody Brandon from the Attorney General's office here on behalf of the defendants who are the movement.
Good morning, Your Honor. This is Kelley Henry on behalf of the plaintiffs. I'm joined this morning with
Yes, Your Honor. Respectfully, Commissioner Strada and Warden Nelson, the defendants, asked this court to enter an order protecting the identities of participants in the execution process and suppliers of lethal injection chemicals. Defendants have proven in their motion and the exhibits attached to that a record of harassment and threats by activists when the identities of execution participants and suppliers are revealed in litigation, even when those identities are disclosed under confidentiality limitations. If the identity of the department's supplier of lethal injection chemicals is revealed, TDOC will lose access to pentobarbital. That's established by the declaration offered in support of the motion. The standard that's applicable here is straightforward. It comes from Rule 26. Plaintiffs cannot discover privileged or irrelevant information. And even if there's information in this case that is not privileged and relevant, the court should still cut off discovery if it's unduly burdensome. That standard provides.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Honor.
Morning.
The defense has made their privilege arguments to the Tennessee Supreme Court in West. They made every argument that they've made to this court in support of a request for the acknowledgement of a common law privilege, and the Tennessee Supreme Court said no. Say that evidentiary privileges are disfavored because they present obstacles to the search for the truth and stand in their to the public's right to every man's evidence. So in fact, it is the public policy of the state of Tennessee to have transparency in the actions of its government. Simply put, there is not a single case that defendants can cite that refers to something called a participant supplier privilege. It's just a cute little name that they came up with, and they're asking this court to create out of whole cloth. Yet this court does not have the authority to do so. And they have failed to provide this court with any evidence whatsoever that such a privilege exists at common law. The other case they cite.
I'll ask for the movement, and then I'll hear from the plaintiff about that, and then we'll conclude the hearing. I'm not going to rule from the bench on this. I want to do a written order. All right. With that, this matter is under advisement. Thanks, everybody.
I'm Demetria Kaladimos. It's Banner and Company. We're just a few days away now from resuming executions. Did you think that day was coming?
I mean, you always know that there was going to be an end in sight. I mean, the moratorium would not last forever. We were surprised, however, at the way this all rolled out.
In what way?
So it sort of started in a clunky way, where the Department of Correction announced that they had a new protocol on December 27th, but refused to give it to anybody. The press, the lawyers, no one could get a copy of it. And we had been requesting, various rolling TPER requests to the Department of Correction, which were all met with denials. But we held back because we didn't want to interfere with whatever the department's process was. We had agreed in 2022 that we would let the process play out. But then on January 8th, I think thanks a lot to the pushback they were getting from the press, they reversed course and released this protocol, which interestingly enough was signed on January 8th and not December 27th. Still no explanation for why that is. But even so, we were sort of led to believe by the Attorney General's office in internal meetings, informal meetings that we had, that there was no rush. And then all of a sudden, on March the 3rd, we got dates from the Tennessee Supreme Court. We weren't expecting that to happen. When the dates came out, we were in the process of doing what's called an administrative appeal. I had asked the Attorney General's office to waive that requirement. It's a requirement for filing a lawsuit, and it really is and was a waste of time because you're appealing to the department who just announced their protocol and telling them that it's unconstitutional. So we knew that it wasn't necessary, but the AG said, no, you have to do it. So we did it. They were in total control of when they would, rule on this administrative appeal. So they finally denied it on March the 13th, and on March 14th, we were in court. But by that time, Mr. Smith already had an execution date of May 22nd. Mr. Black has a date of August the 5th. The date for Mr. Middlebrooks has been stayed, but that was because of an agreement that we made back when it was discovered the department had been lying to the court. And the AG's office asked us to agree to a stay, and in exchange, they said, we will advocate for a stay of execution if Mr. Middlebrooks ever gets a date. We thought that the spirit of that settlement would apply to everyone who was on death row, but we were mistaken.
So Oscar Frank Smith is going to be the next person, barring any last-minute action,
Yes.
Executed in the state of Tennessee.
Yes.
What was his crime? How long has he been behind bars? And what do you know about him as a man?
Oscar was convicted for the murder of his wife and his 2 children, a crime that he has always denied that he committed. The courts did not accept his defense of innocence, and we have no further avenue for presenting that claim. But Oscar would want you and everyone to know that he's always said he didn't do this. He has been on death row since 1985, convicted here in Nashville, and you may well have covered the event. Oscar is like any other 75-year-old man. He can be grumpy at times. He is incredibly grateful to his legal team. He's been really kind to us over the years. He is an artist, and he loves to make gifts for his legal team and his visitors. He does not have family that visits him right now, so he just has his visitor and his legal team and his spiritual advisor. Oscar is deeply spiritual, and that's one of the things that he requested, and that is part of our lawsuit, that he have the right to his spiritual advisor during the last 12 hours of his life, as well as in the chamber. The Department of Correction has granted that request, so his spiritual advisor will be in the room with him. She will be allowed to place her hand on him and pray softly as the execution moves forward.
I know that he's a leather worker.
Yes.
Which requires, ironically, some pretty sharp instruments.
Yes.
You don't necessarily put those in the hands of people that are dangerous.
Right, and he hasn't been a threat to anyone since he's been in jail. You'll have little disagreements with people that you're around for 30 some odd years, right? But Oscar gets to go to arts and crafts, and he gets to use all the equipment necessary to make the beautiful leather legal pad holders that his legal team has that they carry around from place to place. And he's never misused that privilege, and the department's never had any reason to be worried about it.
It's a legal chess game in all areas of law, but it seems like in yours there are a lot of secretive moves, strange moves, and quick decisions that have to be immediately responded to.
You have to be ready at all times, right? So, we didn't know what the department would do or not do. We didn't know whether they were going to use continue to use the pharmacy before who had lied to the court, whether they were going to get a different type of drug. And so we have to always know, what is it that's possible, survey the landscape, as it were. And, now it appears that they have obtained drugs through the gray market, which, again, I didn't think that this government would do, that our state would do that, because it involves dealing with some pretty shady characters and, people who, in addition to providing drugs for lethal injection, are also providing those drugs that they divert out of the commercial stream to people who put them in things like fentanyl and opioids that are, swept up in these these dragnets of DEA, where they're finding that there are traces of pentobarbital in these street drugs. So, once a state government supports the idea of diverting these drugs, which means the DEA is no longer keeping track of them, somebody had to falsify a report somewhere for that to happen, right? Because pentobarbital itself is really only used in a clinical setting in hospitals. You don't go to the Walgreens and get pentobarbital. It's really a rarely used drug. So for them to get this drug, it had to leave a hospital in some way that was not reported to the DEA, and that's a crime. And I just didn't think the state of Tennessee would do that.
Let's back up just a little bit, because I want to talk specifically more about the single drug protocol. Some people, though, listening may not understand the idea of a capital habeas unit. Okay, that's not Greek to me. That's totally Latin. But what does that mean, and why is it necessary?
So by law, everybody who is on death row in this country has a right to file a federal habeas corpus petition. So that is the ability to challenge their conviction and death sentence in state court, but in federal court. It's enshrined in our Constitution. The writ of habeas corpus shall not be denied. And what the courts have found out is that it is far more cost effective to have these specialized units, these capital habeas units, because we specialize in this area of the law, so we can handle more cases more quickly. We get paid less than what we would be paid if we were in private practice, and we can move the cases much more quickly. So, and that's to the benefit of the state and our clients. If our client, for example, has an innocence issue, they want their case to move, right? Mm-hmm. If there's a claim that the state hid evidence or that their lawyers were ineffective, they want their day in court, and that's what we're there to provide. And we do it at a way that actually ends up saving money to the taxpayers.
You fought very vigorously against the 3-drug protocol, and that led to this last moratorium of 3 years and a few days?
So the litigation itself did not.
Okay.
What led to the moratorium, though, was that the day before Oscar was to be executed, on April the 20th, I sent an email to not only the Department of Correction, but also to Governor's legal counsel at the time, who is now our AG, Mr. Scrimeti. And I said, I want to get a copy of the test results of the drugs, because you all told the court that these drugs would be subject to testing, and I want to see it before you execute my client. And I really did it to preserve the record for the next guy. I didn't think they were going to give it to me. I knew they hadn't done it because I was already aware of some litigation that was coming out, and I just wanted there to be a record that I had asked, and they hadn't given it to me. Well, it turns out there was, somebody in the administration realized this was a real problem, that false statements had been made in federal court and in state court about the fact that the department wasn't following their protocol and hadn't followed their protocol, in fact, for any of the executions that had started up in 2018. And so that's what led to the moratorium.
That was a smart move on your part.
You know, I didn't anticipate the results, but I think any good lawyer would do that, right? You're going to execute my client. You said you're going to test the drugs. I already know that there's a problem with these drugs, and I know that there's a problem with the person who's producing them for you, and I'm just going to let you know that I'm watching. And the state doesn't like that about me.
I know you could argue for days, but what is wrong with this new single drug option?
So, as I started earlier, these drugs are likely diverted. They're either compounded, but I don't think they are. If they're compounded, they have all the problems that the other compounding drugs had before.
And you have the same argument as you brought to court last time.
Exactly. These drugs fall out of solution, and when they do so, they feel like rocks through the veins. They don't work effectively. There's all sorts of problems with the way compounding works, particularly in the hands of prison guards who are not trained to handle these drugs. But there's also, with this particular protocol, we've alleged a couple of things. One, that the pentobarbital itself, even if it's used correctly, causes pulmonary edema. This is evidence we didn't know about 5 years ago. This is evidence that came out through reporting from ProPublica and NPR, as well as a DOJ report that came out in January of this year, where the Department of Justice has said they're not going to use pentobarbital because of their concerns with this pulmonary edema.
What does that mean, pulmonary edema?
So pulmonary edema is essentially where the drug is a poison as it's used, right? And so the poison eats away at the lining of the lungs. And so when that lining is eaten away, fluids from the body rush into the lungs. And that's where the edema comes from, the pulmonary edema. You're essentially drowning in your own fluids. It's been described as chemical waterboarding. And what we know from the DOJ report is that from the federal executions that used pentobarbital, this pulmonary edema was present on autopsy. And it's been present on autopsy in other pentobarbital executions that we've seen. But again, the science is just now catching up to us because it's not legal or ethical to have experiments. So the executions become the experiments.
So that's what the drug does.
Right.
The way the drug is procured is a whole other matter.
Right. I mean, we are dealing with people who are, using the veil of the state to act like they are just regular pharmacists or, nurses or whoever it is that they're getting this from, but they're actually drug dealers. I mean, they are taking a drug away from a hospital, out of the commercial stream, and using it in a way that is forbidden by the contract that the hospital has with the manufacturer of the drug. Because the manufacturer of these drugs explicitly put riders on all contracts that they shall not be used in a lethal injection. And that's why the state fights so hard for secrecy, because they are protecting the identities of people who have broken the law in order to obtain these drugs. And when you think about their financial incentive, the Tennesseans reported that Tennessee paid $525,000 for this latest batch of drugs. Indiana paid $900,000. That's a huge financial incentive for whoever's getting these drugs to cut the drug. And so maybe we're not getting the drug that's as potent as it says it is, because why do they think it needs to be? Who's going to check? Who's going to know? They can repackage it and make it look like it's a drug that came from the manufacturer, and they're taking the part that they cut out and using it in illegal drug sales. I mean, that's really scary.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kaladimos. We'll be right back.
Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
They've also changed what's referred to as the death watch.
Yes.
And that basically now will isolate the condemned person and offers them no community up to the point of their demise. That's a huge change.
It's a huge change, and it makes no sense, right? There's never been a problem with anyone on death watch in the 25 years that Tennessee has been executing people. And it's always been 3 days. This is just added torture and punishment, and it really feels like it is retribution for this TDOC having been caught in their lies. And so the way that they can, take it out on our guys is to punish them a little bit more. And there is a real community in Unit 2. Unit 2 is death row. And people are always surprised when they go out there and realize that it is the safest unit in the entire Department of Correction. New staff. There was one young lady there who, I don't know, she could have been 20 years old, maybe 4'10", and she was pregnant, and she had just started working there. And so they put her in Unit 2 because that's where she would be safe. That's where the guys would make sure she was okay, right? These are not the worst of the worst. And these guys have been out there a really long time. Tennessee, the Tennesseans themselves, the public, they don't have an appetite for the death penalty here, particularly in Nashville. Nashville hasn't put a new person on death row in Tennessee in more than a decade. There have only been 2 people this century, Paul Reed and Bobby Leach, and both of them have passed away. These are guys that have been together for years and years and years, and they have community and they have a family. So this 14-day death watch is really an unfair punishment.
Let's go back to the beginning. How in the world does a girl from Missouri get involved in something as I hesitate to say depressing, but certainly not uplifting. Important work, but rarely uplifting.
Right. Although there's a beauty in the brokenness. And it's a real honor that my clients trust me with their stories. That was not something I knew was going to happen when I started. It started with me failing 8th grade history. And the most popular boy in class got picked to be the prosecutor in a mock trial. And the teacher told him that he could pick his opponent. And so he picked me, thinking that was going to be easy. And then I engaged in a little jury selection by picking all of his friends to be my witnesses. And I also had a crush on one of them. But that left the unpopular kids on the jury. And I just loved it. Loved every bit of it, and decided, well, I'm going to be a lawyer. And if I'm going to be a lawyer, I better get good grades. I was first in my family to go to college. But my dad was the local banker in town. I grew up in a suburb, and I always call my dad the original George Bailey, right? He wasn't a rich banker. All of his money was in that bank, and it was an independent community bank. And he used to tell me that the guy who came in with dirt on his boots is the guy who's going to pay me my loan back. And the guy who comes in an Armani suit spent his last dime on that suit. And that's kind of the mindset I've always had, just this underdog, fight for the little guy kind of attitude. And then in law school, I started working for something called the Capital Punishment Resource Center, which was the precursor to the capital habeas units. And I met a guy named Leonard Laws, who was a Vietnam vet. And I remember wearing the MIA POW bracelets. And so I was really touched by Leonard. But he was a volunteer for execution by the time I met him. On the last day of his life, he called to make sure I was okay. And after he was executed, and John Ashcroft was our governor, and he's talked about how Leonard's execution reaffirmed Missouri's commitment to the value of human life. I decided then and there I was going to fight the death penalty for the rest of my life. And I've never looked back, and I've never regretted it.
You have said that the death penalty is not for the worst crimes, but it comes when you have the worst lawyer.
Yeah,
Still believe that?
100%. I was a trial attorney for 7 years, and I did capital trials. And I know the difference between a good trial lawyer and a bad trial lawyer. And then I look at my clients' cases, and my approach to all of my cases is as a trial lawyer. So in 2019, for example, when I got Purvis Payne's case and looked at Purvis's case, his case in the U.S. Supreme Court came out the summer I took the bar. And I always thought Purvis was guilty. And then I looked at his case and I realized, oh my God, this man is innocent. And no one has ever done the investigation that needs to be done in this case. And Purvis is still in prison, but through our work, we were able to get him off death row. And I know if Purvis had had competent counsel, he would have never been convicted. And the sad thing is that means that the person who is responsible for those deaths was never held to account.
Yeah. Are you at all encouraged by the fact that so many states are tossing aside the death penalty, and even here in Tennessee it's being imposed, as you said, far less? Is that encouragement?
It is. I think, for one thing, the trial bar has gotten a whole lot better, right? And juries are a whole lot smarter. We also have life without parole as an option, which is something that most of the guys on death row in Tennessee, that wasn't an option at the time they were sentenced to death. In fact, very few people who were on Tennessee's death row were sentenced after life without parole became an option. And I think that tells us a lot about where our fellow citizens are, right? The death penalty is really about politics and the political will of whoever it is that wants to get elected on the backs of my guys. And what we see both within the state and nationally is that only 2% of the counties are responsible for the executions that actually happen. So that means 98% of the taxpayers are paying for the political will of 2% of the counties. And that's just crazy, right? So when I talk to folks about the death penalty, I often say it is a failed government program that wastes taxpayer money. And when you look at it from that perspective and you see that people are like, you know what, there are other more important public safety values that we need to focus on here. The death penalty is just an anachronism of the past.
Let's do the math, too. You talked about $500,000+ for a single dose of this drug, potentially.
We don't know how much they bought, again, because it's secret.
Right.
But the drug itself retails for about $27, right? So there's a huge profit that's being made. And these folks are getting paid. I don't know that they were paid in cash in Tennessee. I know they were paid in cash in Idaho. But just think about that lack of accountability. What other government contractor in the state of Tennessee is going to get paid $525,000 and a taxpayer doesn't have the right to know who they are? That's not democratic.
And let's also count the many, many years of room and board, if you will,
Right.
Because Oscar is how many years now?
Oscar's been on, I want to say, nearing 40 years now. Yeah, so he's 75 years old. And I just want to say for Oscar in particular, it's particularly cruel to execute him without the opportunity to challenge this lethal injection protocol when it was his case that led to the moratorium, right? And just because of a circumstance that one client was in court and another wasn't on this very same issue, one client gets a stay of execution and the other doesn't. That's just really arbitrary and unfair. And when we think about what Oscar went through 3 years ago, he was literally taking communion when it was announced that he wasn't going to be executed, when the warden came in and just really told my colleague Amy Harwell, Ms. Harwell, you have to leave. Without any explanation, nobody knew what was going on at that point. And obviously we're grateful, but there's an added layer of trauma that goes with that.
It's Banner and Company. My guest is federal public defender Kelley Henry. We'll be right back. So how many executions have you witnessed, and how in the world do you cope with life after that?
2, John Johnson and Ed Zagorski. For a long time, I had a policy that no one in my office would be allowed to witness. People
Why?
people in my community have committed suicide. They've suffered from PTSD. There have been lawyers who've witnessed who quit because they couldn't do the job anymore. So I knew that it would be really emotionally taxing. And prior to the executions that I witnessed, we would recruit lawyers who didn't know our client, usually somebody who had military experience. But what I discovered through the litigation was that it was really important for there to be someone in the room who actually understood the process and what was going on, so that they could record what was happening for the
With
next...
the context of...
Yeah, like you just know the science, you know what's supposed to happen, and you can't translate that to another lawyer. And it was the only argument my former boss, Henry Martin, and I ever had. And I worked for Henry for 25 years, and I adore him. And I know you've talked to him.
Yeah.
And he said, who's going to run my chew if you can't come to work the next day? And so I promised him that I would make sure and work with a trauma expert both before and after witnessing, and I did that. And
Was it helpful?
It was. It was. And, what I found for me, my kids are grown. I don't know if I would have wanted to do this when I had little kids. But for me, what I was able to say is there was a meaning and a purpose for me to be there, and that was to bear witness for my client. And, if something went wrong, as has happened in other states, I would be able to act quickly and get to the court. And so there was a reason for me to be there.
The fact that you're a woman, do you think your guys, as you call them, the men trust you more and perhaps confide in you more than if you were someone in a suit?
That's a really great question. So when I first started doing the work here in Tennessee, I was pregnant with my youngest child. And Byron Black, who is scheduled for execution August 5th, was one of my first clients. And the guys out there, they're very protective of pregnant women. So they came to know me as a mother figure in that way. I hug all my guys, right? And I'm just myself with them. I have some great men who work with me, so I can't say that they don't have that same ability, but I do feel like the mom in me comes out a lot.
Mm-hmm. I don't want anyone to think that you do not have a heart for victims.
Yeah.
You're also entrenched in that world of people whose lives have been taken, the consequences of really serious crime. And I'm sure that is part of your everyday concern.
100%. I'm a big believer in a process called defense-based victim outreach. And it is a way in which someone from the defense team can liaison with victims' family members in order to provide them information that they might not be able to get from the prosecution. We don't force ourselves on any victim's family member, but they're not the enemy. They lost a loved one. And, we take great care in my office, for example, to make sure that autopsy photos are kept protected. They're not just laying around. People can't just look at them because they're curious, right? We honor the victims, right? But we can honor the victims while still protecting the rights of our clients. And I hate that the adversarial process does what it does to victims' family members. But I also hate that the politicization of the death penalty also harms the victims' family members. There was a recent Tennessean op-ed from Rafia where she talked about this $525,000 on drugs, how that could be spent to help victims' family members, to get them counseling, to help pay for funerals, to help their families in need if they've lost a breadwinner. Like so many different ways in which the criminal legal system could help victims' family members. They're not helped by executions.
Yeah, have you encountered family members after executions who are as traumatized as the crime itself almost?
I have. Don Johnson's situation. So his daughter, Cynthia Vaughn, her mother was the victim in the case, and for years she hated Don. And then, reached out to him and talked to him, and he told me, give her my entire file. I want her to see everything. And, Cynthia was able to find some peace, but, when she asked for counseling from the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, she was denied and told that she'd waited too long to ask. So, I see those little unfairnesses in the system all the time. And then in Gail Owens' case, her son, Stephen, ultimately came to forgive Gail and became her biggest advocate for clemency. And I will never forget the day that Governor Bredesen granted her clemency. We found out on 10 minutes notice. It was like the one day I came to the office with no makeup and a white t-shirt and jeans. And
surprise.
Like the governor's making an announcement at the old Supreme Court, and I didn't even know that there was a Supreme Court anywhere except, the big one, but there's a small one in the Capitol. And we're driving around the Capitol looking for the press conference, and I've got Gail on one cell phone and Stephen on the other. And I'm saying, you're going to live. And he's like, oh, Mom, this is great. So, a young man who went from pain and anger to forgiveness and hope. And then they ultimately ended up writing a book together. So that's really meaningful when you can make that happen.
Is life without parole suitable punishment enough?
It is. I can't tell you that I'm a person who believes in imprisonment at all, because I think our carceral system is incredibly flawed. But if the goal is you want to make sure that someone never walks the streets again because you are afraid that that person might harm someone else, we can keep them incarcerated for the rest of their lives. And I have seen people who are incarcerated who have meaningful lives. So it's not like they'll never be able to have joy again, right? But you can serve the punishment aspect without the state having to take the ultimate step in extinguishing their life.
Do you foresee a day when young attorneys will not have to worry about habeas units?
You know what? I do. So even with all of the recent talk about executions, right? Our current president was president before, and his administration sought the death penalty many times, and they didn't get a lot of death sentences. Because when you get a jury in the box with good lawyers who know what they're doing, who present a case to the jury, they don't return a death sentence. And ultimately, we are going to see fewer and fewer new death sentences, as we already have in Tennessee. And then my job will go away, and I'll retire, and that'll be great.
Banner and Company is a production of the new Nashville Banner. This episode was produced, edited, and mixed by Steve Harouche. Original music by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. We do a little thing here. Our little ritual is our last question is in the fishbowl. So you've been staring at them. Now's the time to select one.
All right. This is the last one put in, so I'm going to take it.
Oh, okay.
From Major Jackson. Do you remember
the first time you tasted water?
I remember the first time I tasted ocean water. On a trip when I was little to what is now still my favorite vacation spot in the world, Marco Island, Florida, and going out into the ocean water, and the ocean is still the place I go to for comfort.